This is K.M. Weiland, and you are listening to the 618th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I hope you enjoy this week's episode, Genre Tips, How to Write Literary Fiction. But first, this is just a quick note to say that my new book is now available for pre-order. And that book is Writing Archetypal Character Arcs, subtitled Beyond the Hero's Journey. And I will be telling you a little bit more about that in the future when it's closer to its release date, which will be March 30th. And do stay tuned because, as always, I will be sharing a very exciting prize giveaway to celebrate the launch. I have a really fun idea in mind for this giveaway. Anyway, I'm very excited about this book, and if you're interested, you can pre-order it on Amazon right now. Again, the book is called Writing Archetypal Character Arcs Beyond the Hero's Journey. And now, back to today's episode. So, what exactly is literary fiction? Although the term often means many different things to different people, the general consensus is that literary fiction encompasses dramatic stories that consciously focus on existential themes and artistic prose. Now, naturally, these elements can appear in any type of story, so deciding you want to learn how to write literary fiction can be helpful not only in writing stories that specifically fit this category, but in raising the vibration on any type of story. Ironically, the term literary fiction is often used in opposition to the term genre, which I guess means that we have the literary genre and the genre. Literary fiction is a somewhat contested term used by some writers to indicate a higher level of writing, and by others as a crack at elitism. Back in the day, when what is properly considered genre fiction was classed only as lowbrow pop fiction for the masses, literary fiction was the domain of the serious writer. These days, however, when so many genre entries are themselves high art, the borders of what is literary fiction and what is not have become a bit mistier. It also used to be, and still is to some degree, considered a rule that genre fiction focuses on plot, that is, events happening to the protagonist, whilst literary fiction focuses more on character and theme, that is, how the protagonist reacts to events. Although each of these approaches create significantly different reading experiences, both of which are legitimate and wonderful in their own right, this argument between plot and character has been largely responsible for creating the dualistic idea that story must be one or the other, and that one must be better than the other. Of course, the truth is story requires both plot and character. You can't have one without the other. All stories have plot, except perhaps the most wildly experimental novels, which honestly I would class as a genre of its own. So, if we can't narrow down the strict definition of literary fiction as fiction that focuses on drama, offers existential themes, is artistic, emphasizes beautiful prose, crosses over into no other genre, values character over plot, then how can we determine what is literary fiction and what is not? Unlike genres such as romance and mystery, literary fiction is not defined by its beats, nor is it strictly a milieu backdrop like fantasy and historical fiction. It can be set anywhere, anytime. It can focus on love stories, on murder investigations, on supernatural evil, on slices of life. It can feature characters who are human, animal, or even inanimate. It's kind of like the old saw. You know it when you see it. For my money, literary fiction is primarily defined by attitude and perspective. Any story could be told as literary fiction. What makes it so is how it is told. Although literary fiction contains all these same structural pieces as any other type of story, it is more intent on the journey than the destination. It looks around. It wants to see and observe. It wants to stop and ask questions. And usually it does so from a slightly distanced perspective. Even if it utilizes a deep POV that puts readers right there in the characters' heads, what is evoked is the sense of being one step back from the action, observing, commenting, noticing the deeper meaning. So if that sounds interesting, let's take a quick overview of how to write literary fiction. Tip number 1, story structure in literary fiction. Understanding how to intertwine inner and outer conflict. The notion that literary fiction is synonymous with plotless fiction is, as I say, a misconception. What's true is that literary fiction is not as dependent upon or hemmed in by specific beats as are genres like romance and mystery. However, the basic structural arc underlying a story's plot becomes all the more important in supporting and unifying the often sprawling and sometimes abstract events and motifs within a literary story. What's also true is that the plot in literary fiction is often less concerned with its story's external conflict, even if it's rip-roaring, and more concerned with the character's internal conflict. You might say literary fiction is more interested in character arc than structure. But, surprise, that too is a false paradigm. Why? Because the mechanics of character arc are inherently structural. Plot structure can be viewed as the emergent of character arc. The entire arc of what we recognize as story is merely the externalized structure of the natural and inevitable pattern of human transformation. In short, if a literary story creates a magnificent character arc, you can be sure it is also well structured. The structural beats in any story will tell you what it is about. In a literary story, those beats will focus intently on the inner conflict and evolution of the characters. Even if you're writing a story with a relatively loose focus on structure, just double-checking that the 10 major structural moments are all focused on your character's internal journey will help you ensure both plot and character are powerfully aligned. And those structural elements are the hook, the inciting event, the first plot point, the first pinch point, the midpoint or second plot point, the second pinch point, the third plot point, the climax, the climactic moment, and the resolution, which you can read about in more detail in my book, Structuring Your Novel. For example, F. Scott Fitzgerald's beloved classic, The Great Gatsby, is a pitch-perfect example of how external conflict, of which there is plenty as Gatsby jets around New York City, causing and enduring all manner of havoc, can play out primarily through the lens of a character's internal conflict. In this instance, through the observations of narrator Nick Carraway, who stands at a remove from the relational machinations of Gatsby and the other characters, and who undergoes a disillusionment arc as a result. Tip number 2, character in literary fiction. Backstory as the origin of motivation. Genre fiction asks, what will happen? Literary fiction, however, is often more concerned with what did happen. Its most urgent question is, why? Although sometimes this exploration may offer an external plot that is intent on uncovering revelations new to the main characters, it just as often focuses on diving deep into an exploration of the characters' own pasts, memories, feelings, events, old hurts, lost loves, delusions, and dreams. All are excavated and re-examined in the character's search for meaning. Backstory and its motivating ghosts are important catalysts for the character arc in any type of story. But in literary fiction, the uncovering of how the past has affected the future is often of primary importance. Alternate timelines are a popular device in literary fiction, allowing backstory to be explored side by side with the character's current dilemmas. And even when a story is told in linear fashion, it is understood that much of what we see is context for a final realization. This emphasis on the causal effects within a character's personal development doesn't necessarily require a huge or shocking event in the character's backstory. Rather, the emphasis is on the why of how characters ended up where they did or are making the choices they are currently faced with. For example, Toni Morrison's finely wrought Beloved drops a horrifyingly shocking backstory bomb halfway through when it reveals what happened to main character Seth's almost crawling baby girl. In a different type of story, this revelation might have been played for all the drama it was worth. In this quiet exploration of the effects of slavery, the revelation is equally quiet, made all the more horrifying by its unflinching deliberateness in examining the reasons for and effects of Seth's choices. Although it is a huge plot moment, it is chiefly utilized as an exploration of character. Tip number 3. Theme in literary fiction. Theme as message versus theme as question. Although theme will emerge from any well-constructed plot and/or character arc, literary fiction is noted for its conscious exploration and execution of its themes. Heavy-handed themes that present themselves as answers to their readers are not welcome in any type of story, and this becomes all the more true in a literary story that very likely will be exploring its themes on purpose. For example, a genre action story about a brave naval admiral may express themes of courage, duty, and honor merely through the external actions and outcomes in the plot. A literary story will go deeper in examining the character's interiority as he struggles literally with these questions in his own mind. Ironically, this means literary fiction can easily come across as far more moralistic and on the nose than most genre fiction. The key to any successful exploration of theme is focusing less on the answers or lessons and more on the questions that are inherent within the character's struggles. There's never any need to spell out a thematic premise for audiences. The outcome of the plot events will always present the author's thesis on how certain causes lead to certain effects. Particularly in literary fiction, which can sometimes be more open-ended than other types of stories, thematic emphasis should be less on proving a certain point and more on an honest exploration of how certain thematic questions affect the character's outlooks and choices. Arguably more than in any other genre, allowing characters to choose wrong and showing the effects those choices have in the end can be especially powerful in literary fiction. For example, The Remains of Day by Kazuo Ishiguro utilizes flashbacks to explore the choices of its protagonist, lifetime butler Stevens, who chose to remain loyal to his Nazi-sympathizing employer, not because he agreed with the politics, but because he was so identified with his work. This raises questions he must explore in his present as he seeks to reunite with a woman he might have married had he made different choices. Tip number 4. Scene structure in literary fiction. Controlling pacing via action and reaction. That certain attitude of literary fiction, its focus on the interiority of its characters, and its leisurely pacing can be tricky to define, much less evoke in one's own writing. However, one of the best hacks can be found in scene structure. Scenes can be divided into two basic parts, action and reaction. These two parts are sometimes referred to as scene, or the action part, and sequel, which is the reaction part, which can then be divided down further into 3 parts apiece, looking like this. Scene being divided into goal, where the character wants something, conflict, in which an obstacle is introduced, and outcome, in which the initial goal is either obstructed or leads to a new goal. And then the sequel can be broken down into reaction, where the character reacts emotionally to the previous outcome, dilemma, in which the previous outcome has created a new problem, and decision, in which the character decides upon a new goal. Stories that emphasize external action usually put more weight upon the action half of the scene. In these stories, sometimes the reaction half may be summarized rather than dramatized to allow the narrative to return to the action as quickly as possible. Literary stories, however, flip the script. In literary fiction, the reaction or sequel is usually more markedly emphasized. The action still happens, just as in any story. Indeed, literary stories can be just as full of wartime explosions, psychopathic murderers, and passionate trysts in the rain as any other type of story. The difference is that the action portion of the scene will not always be heavily dramatized. In some instances, the action may not be dramatized in the story's real time at all, but rather looked back upon from the character's reaction phase. For example, I first noticed the use of this technique when reading Catherine McGendy's book Sweetie, about a timid young girl who befriends a feral mountain child. The book's leisurely emphasis of sequels over scenes takes nothing away from its potency or urgency. And tip number 5, prose in literary fiction. When beauty is truth and truth is beauty. Those who love to read literary fiction or want to write it often return to the genre again and again simply for the beautiful artistry of its prose. Although beautiful prose can, of course, be found in any genre, it is a necessity in literary fiction. Not only does it help pull readers into a story in which it's possible that, strictly speaking, not much is happening, it is also an important tool for deepening the story's thematic exploration. Readers of literary fiction expect more from the genre than just a good story, although they expect that too. They expect a kind of truth from the prose that is found nowhere more strongly than in poetry. Literary novels are, in their way, like beautiful prose poems. Their word choices are exquisite, every syllable chosen not just for its efficacy, but for its symbolic effect. More than that, the prose creates a mirror that is held up to both our darkest and most beautiful parts. Those mirrors are only clear when the word craft has been honed to communicate not just to the reader's conscious mind, but to the parts of them that exist beyond the words. For example, one of the most gorgeous books ever written, in my opinion, The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, evokes its fantasy worldscape through prose that is, as one reviewer put it, seductive and mysterious. This is also a wonderful example of a genre story that crosses over into literary fiction. More than anything else, literary fiction is a style. It evokes an effect that allows it to explore life itself with a magnifying glass, to go deep in observing the tiniest details and the most tempestuous human experiences. It is a beautiful genre that can be melded with almost any other style to create unforgettable stories that appeal to many different types of readers. And now I hope you will stop by the site and tell me your opinion. What are your thoughts on how to write literary fiction? If you'd like to be part of the word player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Amazon Music, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to do something to support helping writers become authors, it always means a ton if you're able to leave just a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Also, many thanks to those who support my work on Patreon. Your patronage helps make helping writers become authors and its many resources available to writers everywhere. If you're interested in becoming a patron, you can find out more at patreon.com/kmweiland. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.